In the vibrant city of Onitsha, where the streets bustled with life and the market echoed with the chatter of merchants, lived a 22-year-old girl named Chidima. Life had been cruel to her, but despite all her hardships, she remained kind. Chidima grew up in a small room in one of the poorest parts of the city. Her parents had passed away when she was young, leaving her to fend for herself. She barely had enough to eat most days, but her heart was pure, and she always tried to help others whenever she could. One scorching afternoon, as Chidima was walking home from the market with an empty basket, no one had bought her goods, she noticed something unusual. An elegant black car was parked by the roadside, and beside it stood a woman, struggling with several shopping bags. The woman was dressed in fine clothes, her jewelry sparkling in the sun, but she looked overwhelmed by the weight of the bags. Without hesitation, Chidima rushed to the woman's side. "Let me help you, madam," Chidima said, already taking one of the heavy bags from her. The woman looked surprised for a moment, but then smiled. "Thank you, my dear. These bags are heavier than I thought." Chidima helped the woman carry the bags to the car and load them into the trunk. Her arms ached from the weight, but she didn't complain. When they were done, the woman turned to her, still smiling. "You have such a kind heart. What's your name?" she asked. "My name is Chidima," she replied, bowing her head slightly. "I'm Mrs. Ifeoma," the woman said, looking at her more closely now. She noticed the worn-out slippers Chidima was wearing and the threadbare dress she had on. "You look like you've had a hard time, Chidima. Why don't I give you something for your help?" Chidima shook her head. "No, madam. I didn't help you for money." Mrs. Ifeoma was impressed by her humility. "I insist," she said, reaching into her purse to take out some money. But before she could hand it over, Chidima quickly stepped back. "Thank you, madam. But I really can't accept anything." Mrs. Ifeoma looked at her with admiration. "You're a rare one, Chidima. Most people would have taken the money by now. You remind me of myself, many years ago." Chidima didn't know what to say. She simply smiled politely and nodded, thinking that this was the end of the encounter. But as she turned to leave, Mrs. Ifeoma called out to her. "Wait," she said. "Let me at least give you a ride home." Chidima hesitated. She didn't want to accept too much kindness from a stranger, but something about Mrs. Ifeoma's warm smile made her feel safe. Finally, she agreed, and they both got into the car. As they drove through the busy streets, Mrs. Ifeoma glanced at Chidima, her curiosity growing. "You didn't ask for anything, and yet I can tell you've been through a lot. Tell me, how did you end up like this?" Chidima sighed softly, her eyes looking out the window at the crowded streets of Onitsha. "Life hasn't been kind to me, madam. My parents died when I was little, and I've been on my own ever since. I try to walk, but it's never enough. No matter how hard I try, I just can't seem to make it." Mrs. Ifeoma listened quietly, nodding as Chidima spoke. After a long pause, she said, "I understand what it feels like to struggle. But there are ways to change your life, if you're willing to do what it takes." Chidima turned to her, confused. "What do you mean, madam?" Mrs. Ifeoma smiled mysteriously. "You see. Let me show you something." The car finally stopped in front of a grand mansion, much larger than anything Chidima had ever seen. It had tall gates, lush gardens, and marble floors that sparkled like diamonds. Chidima stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer beauty of it all. "Come inside," Mrs. Ifeoma said, leading her through the grand doors. The house was filled with expensive furniture, gold ornaments, and crystal chandeliers. Everything looked perfect, but there was something about the silence in the house that made Chidima feel uneasy. Mrs. Ifeoma led her to a lavish sitting room and gestured for her to sit down. "You're probably wondering how I came to have all of this," Mrs. Ifeoma began. "I wasn't born into wealth, Chidinma. I came from nothing, just like you. But life taught me a harsh lesson: to get what you want, you have to make sacrifices. Chidinma sat quietly, her curiosity growing. What kind of sacrifices? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Ifeoma leaned in, her eyes dark and serious. I didn't get rich by hard work alone. I joined something powerful. A secret society. A secret code. And it changed my life forever. Chidinma's heart began to race. She had heard whispers of secret societies, groups of people who gained wealth and power through dark means. But she never imagined someone like Mrs. Ifeoma would be involved. Secret code. Chidinma repeated, her voice trembling. Yes, Mrs. Ifeoma said, her eyes looking onto Chidinma's. It's a group of powerful people who help each other succeed. But joining the code requires sacrifice. You must give something in return for the wealth and power you receive. One night, Chidinma sat in her luxurious apartment, staring out at the city lights. She had everything she wanted, but she didn't feel free. The power and wealth had come at a price she wasn't sure she was willing to keep paying. She went to Mrs. Ifeoma's mansion the next day, her heart heavy with doubt. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Chidinma confessed, her voice trembling. I thought I wanted this life, but it's not what I expected. Mrs. Ifeoma's expression turned cold. There's no turning back now, Chidinma. You made your choice. I don't want to hurt people, Chidinma said, tears welling up in her eyes. I thought this was going to make my life better, but it's only made me feel trapped. Mrs. Ifeoma stood, her eyes sharp. We all make sacrifices, Chidinma. That's the price of success. You can't have everything without giving something in return. Chidinma's heart sank. She realized then that she had traded her freedom for wealth, and there was no way out. The secret code owned her now. And so, Chidinma continued to live in luxury, but the cost weighed heavily on her soul. She had everything she wanted, but she had lost herself in the process. The price of power was far greater than she had ever imagined.